Moving on to Darren, he is our Chief Science Officer for the University of Science and Philosophy. He's an inventor, musician, cosmogonist, and philosopher. 2011, he finished his formal academic education, earning a BA in biology and a minor in chemistry from Castleton State College in Castleton, Vermont. His undergraduate research project began in the summer of 2011, focusing on planet genetics and gene expression. In the summer of 2013, following significant weight loss and mental spiritual transformations, he began an intensive study of Walter Russell's Cosmogony after serendipitously finding a copy of a new concept of the universe from a discussion related to Louis Curvan's work on biological transmutation. Also began working at Burlington Laboratories, first as a lab technician, then subsequent promotion to laboratory scientist. He currently works primarily with a solid phase, work there with a solid phase extraction of LC-MS, MS, and GC-MS, MS analytical methods. In 2014, after intensive personal study of all available Russell material and many lengthy conversations with Alan Hayes of WalterRussell.com, led to the formulation of ideas regarding technical applications of the Russell cosmogony and a deeper understanding of the science in general. 2015, he replicated the experiments described on page 133 of Atomic Suicide by building conical solenoid coils and figuring out the correct winding orientation. Around this time, he began connecting with myself at the USP and other Russell students, traveled to Swannanoa in November of 2015 to extensively search the USP archives. He's currently actively working on a home AC generation system and power multiplication systems to alleviate energy dependency. Darren has done just an astronomical amount of work in a short period of time, and we aim to continue with that discovery. We are seeing some validation in different areas of concept, and again, where we are at this point, what we're going to be able to accomplish in the future is really unlimited. I can let him tell you more about that, but it's just a great honor to work with such an amazing young man whose heart is absolutely in this all the way and all for the right reasons. So please give me help in giving a warm welcome to Darren Colomb.
Hello. Is this on? Can y'all hear me? No? Testing? There we go. Is that better? Hello. Okay. So, we've heard a lot of things about the dawn of a new era in human relations, and this is the technology piece. There we go. Oh, that's better. Technology, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. That's my way of giving back to the world using my talents. I firmly believe everybody comes in with a purpose and something to do and something to accomplish, and in that way, in that uniqueness, give back and share what we know. And this has been my journey, is being really interested in the technology and trying to glean as much wisdom from Walter Russell and Lao Russell as I can. So I was trying to think of a good place to start, and I figured the best thing is in the back of Why You Cannot Die, Lao Russell wrote this about the University of Science and Philosophy, its plan and purpose. The University of Science and Philosophy, formerly the Walter Russell Foundation, is the first university ever to be founded whose sole purpose is the awakening of that divine spark of man's spiritual nature, which alone can give birth to a united and enduring civilization with its desired pinnacle of peace, happiness, and prosperity that all men eternally seek, by giving man the kind of knowledge which will aid him in the transformation of his self from what he now is to the consummate being of his highest aspiration. That sounds pretty good. So, yeah, everybody's used this image. and I'm going to use it too, because it's really good. And I like to focus on this part because I think this is maybe where some confusion comes in, but basically our senses are one-way conscious. They're not two-way, but in fact the universe is two-way. We see forward sequences which create the idea of time in a timeless universe where time sequences are voided by their backward flow, but it's important to know that we cannot sense the backward flow. And this is very important because this is why science is in its current configuration stating things like second law of thermodynamics and entropy, where everything's dying a heat death. They cannot see half of the wave cycle. And this is just so important to know that I have to always kind of state it initially. So this is in the home study course too. This just shows you the sheer limitation of our senses. This little line right here out of all this vibratory information is our limit of visibility, meaning anything out here is just empty space. It's invisible to us. So Lao also says in the same book, Why You Cannot Die, the mind is located in the pineal gland, which centers the two lobes of the brain. Thought waves of sensing extend from the still center of knowledge and power. The goal of man is to think from his knowing mind instead of just sense from his brain, which is but a central switchboard for body sensations and a storehouse of sense-recorded memories. As both brain lobes are equal mates and have equal power, both carry the positive sign. The mind is still and therefore carries the sign of negation of motion. So what this means when I was giving a talk at Tesla Tech this summer is I was speaking to a room full of scientists and electrical engineers, and I said to them, what we need to do is redefine our definition of what we mean by a dipole. A dipole is no longer a positive and a negative at either ends. It's actually two positives from one negative, because negative means negation or cessation of motion. And I can't really say it any better than Lao said it in the video. God told her there are two positives. And this actually has implications because all of our electrical knowledge is based around positive and negative. So if we're going to change that, we need to know why. So I'm going to talk about the life principle. God is life. It's pretty simple. But if that's true, that means that life is a property of mind and not matter, so there's no energy in matter. The eternal mind which created matter is motionless, changeless, and undivided. The reality of life must therefore be eternally still, timeless, changeless, and undivided. The reality of anything must be in its cause and not in its effect. An effect simulates its cause as a reflection in a mirror simulates the image of the light which cast it. But no reasoning, thinking person would ever say that the reflection is the reality. For the mirror of the reflection could be withdrawn, but the light of the projector would still be. The light is omnipresent and eternal. This is the source of life. Oops. So I'm going to do just a really basic kind of 7 images and some text to just take you through creation, because if you were here last year or if you've seen my YouTube videos, I go pretty in depth over the course of 2 talks into the science and everything. So I don't want to kind of do too much of that, especially at the end of the day here. So I'm just going to take you through creation, and then we're going to get into the meat of the talk, which is the technology side of things. So the entire universe of matter and space could be properly described as one centering omnipresent light, the source of life. It's divided into countless centering focal points throughout the universe, and each pair surrounded by mirrors, the wave field boundary, into which the centering light is reflected and from which their simulated light is reflected. This description as properly describes the solar system as it does the universe, as above, so below. It also properly describes each atom and corpuscular cathode ray of matter, for the invisible light of the soul and of mind centers each, extends to each, and is re-extended from each. So it's all interconnected. These images come from basically the last chapter in Atomic Suicide before the addendum. And I've been in a position to try to summarize Walter's science, and it's hard to do in a short amount of time, but I realized that the last 7 images in the book are actually almost just about everything you need, in addition to the subtext. But Walter's saying that this point, that point we were talking about where life exists, the source of the life, is centering this cube. And the motion always is given outward. Love is an outward expression. It gives out from itself. This is the initial giving that sets things in motion and basically begins the manifestation process of our 3-dimensional world. So matter begins by a division of stillness in the inert gases, and it is projected in 2-way motion into pairs of octave wave tones, which we call elements. The principle of projection is the same that man uses in projecting the concept of his idea onto a moving form of idea, much like this projector is projecting this image right here. It is the dual radar principle of nature. We're going to talk a little bit about radar. Reduced to its ultimate simplicity, nature is a series of echoes. When a sound leaves you, you are the source. You are giving out. The sound wave hits a flat surface and then it's bounced back, it's recompressed. And you recompress it in your ears and you have an echo. So it's a giving and a re-giving. And this is an analogy that's applicable to everything in the universe. So this is God's end of the cosmic bridge. This is where motion begins its projection into space for the purpose of simulating mind idea. And we'll pay attention to this corner reflector here because the next image is going to show you what happens when it, just like the echo, when it hits something. We're going to show what happens when it hits the corner of the cube. You get spheres. And it took me a long time. I had to kind of flip back and forth from this one to this one because it almost makes it seem like, oh, well, would be an evacuated space, and then it would fill that potential, with a sphere. But I realized that what Walter is actually showing us here is that the actual source was out here. The center of the cube is out here, and it's coming in. So if you can see, if we start here and there is an expansion outward from this direction going toward the corner of the cube, and the corner reflector is basically a tetrahedron, then you would make 4 quadrants in each hemisphere of one sphere as a reflection, as a reaction to the outward motion from the center of the cube. In the corner of the cube, you get a composite sphere. So this is man's end of the cosmic bridge, where motion reaches a maximum. You cannot go beyond this point because it is the end of the cube. So the cube projector, shown in the previous one, is repeated, that's the key word. It's repeated in the corner receiver. Motion, which has been divided into pairs and thrown out in space by the projector, is multiplied in the vortices of the receiver. If you take 3 mirrors that are flat and you put them kind of so that you make a triangle, and you bring any object, you will see that as you approach that central point where they all meet, all of the reflected images in the mirror compress. They come together. They integrate. And this is basically the centripetal principle. The vortices are from the shape of the corner reflector. So this basically is the same principle they use in radar too. Forms and sounds which are born in space are thus echoed back to space. And they again, as I said, terminate here. So this shows it even a little bit better. And what I like about this one is it also shows you, do you notice how when you have one central sphere in the corner, which is the maximum of its compression, if you look at the other corners of the cube, here, here, and here, And you can also, in your mind, using your imagination, predict what the neighboring wave field will also do next to it. You can realize that what you end up with is whenever you have maximum compression in the corner, you have evacuation around it. And what do we see when we look out into the universe? We see solid matter surrounded by space. So this is showing you literally that geometry, space has a geometry. And because of that geometry, we have solids or liquids surrounded by gases. And when gases become rarefied enough, we just simply refer to it as empty space. So every form of matter which is projected into space has an antimatter image. You see the antimatter image now? Within space, which ultimately, voids it and reborn it. Antimatter concepts have their own balancing relation to their material images in space geometry. So this is an entire new field, and we just saw a bunch from Hannah about that, so I won't go into too much, but Russell continually said that this new science of space geometry is going to eliminate basically all of the experimenting that goes into, material science or chemistry or what have you. If you know the shape of the wave field, you will know the crystallization of the matter. So here he's flattened it, the previous image, just to show you that at 180 degrees across the central equator, you always have opposite conditions. And they interchange, and each one becomes the other in rhythmic fashion. So the pendulum which swings one way has an invisible counterpart which swings the other way. This drawing illustrates a sun at the crest of its wave, which will eventually be voided by its evacuated hole awaiting at the trough. And it'll, again, as I said, again reborn from that same point. It's just an oscillation around one point, that point of God-mind. So here we see not negative at the center, but we see zero, the negation of motion. And we see that we get these seemingly two different directions from one direction of motion. This is a perpetual interrelationship of matter and antimatter, as shown in the previous image, which gives and re-gives to each other for perpetual sequences of rebirth into each other. The outstanding characteristic feature of nature is repetition. Life and death are other names for it. Reincarnation is yet another name for it. So repetition, and also Russell is using the word perpetual, which is interesting. In other words, science is saying that you can't build a perpetual motion machine, and yet we live in one called the universe. So here, this is showing the octave progression principle. I want you to especially keep this shape in mind, the fact that you start with large volume and you compress the volume in series of rings in a conical fashion to create matter. And then once matter is compressed to its ultimate pressure, it has to expand on the central equator here, which is a mirrored extension of the two cathode planes. And the reason I want you to remember this image is because I'm going to show you a real world experiment with conical solenoids that actually proves this, that this is really happening not only in space but everywhere, anywhere in the universe. So this is the principle of projection of mind desire, energy into pairs of tones to create the 9 octaves of tones, which constitutes nature. A spiral nebula seen edgewise here, which occupies the amplitude position of the wave current, corresponds with the loop of force, which centers every polarized unit of an electric current. So when you see this, you're seeing an electric current in space, but we see it around copper wires when we have wires, running around your house. It's the same principle. And Terrence talked about this, so did Hannah and lots of people. The only thing I want to point out about this, what this means to me, is that when matter is projected into seeming form, it's frozen. It's frozen into its condition, just like ice. And when ice is frozen, don't you see crystalline structures appear what that means to me is that, like Terrence was saying, that there are no straight lines, but there are curved lines that are reflections of purely straight lines in the cubic wave field. And so when we see all these different geometric forms, and you're seeing them in crystals of bismuth or kind of aluminum or types of metals or even water, what's actually happening is the matter is in motion. It's violently in motion to simulate density, but it will reflect the different angles within the cube given its pressure condition in the wave structure. And that means that when it's frozen, it will reflect these different images. It's a bit hard to conceive, but basically it's a reflection. So when you see a crystal, it's a reflection of the invisible space geometry. So you can't see the space geometry, but you can see the mirror reflection of it in the crystalline structure of matter. And I think that's worth pointing out. So this is the basis for the universal buildup from two-dimensional plane to three-dimensional cube, and back again into disappearance into two-dimensional plane. In Atomic Suicide, the Russells basically state that God is non-dimensional, and that thinking is two-dimensional because this is the separation of the pineal into the two lobes of the brain, just like the electric thinking process. You're dividing an equilibrium into two polarized extensions. So so thinking is a two-dimensional process, and then action and reaction sequences, which is what we call time, is three-dimensional. So you can see the actual buildup from nothing into what we call simulated reality, or just reality, which is a simulation. So in the science of tomorrow, which is what the Russells referred to all of this metaphysical and scientific unity, they referred to it as the science of tomorrow. We'll be able to look upon matter for what it actually is, as visible evidence of work performed by mind thinking, or thinking mind, of the Creator, and the vast space around it as the eternal state of rest between the Creator's work periods, just like intervals of silence between sounds. So they have an image of just the undivided white light and the spectrum divided pairs, which are forever seeking unity. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of just creation mechanics, which is what I call it, because I really want to just talk a lot about the technology, and I want to talk specifically about the technology that the Russells themselves were saying would eventually come about. And what's interesting is some of it already has come about thanks to Nikola Tesla, and we're going to get into that. But I basically want to say that the Russell cosmogony is based upon the control of matter and energy by its cause. We're actually starting with the cause instead of dealing around with the effects, which is kind of where science is at the moment. And the cause is in the invisible light of space, and it's not in the effects of matter. So they basically pointed out three things, and I did talk about the first one last year a little bit, and so I won't spend too much on it because I want to get to the other two. But the first is power multiplication. And specifically, we're going to look at power multiplication electrically by visible light, which is what you basically can call all of the lights. You're using electricity to produce a product called light. Then we're going to talk about power transmutation, seemingly turning one element into another. Also electrically, chemically, and optically. And number three, power projection, which is wireless power distribution by the invisible magnetic light. So these are the three that we're going to cover. So let's start with power multiplication. Last year at the homecoming, I talked a lot about Walter's optical dynamo concept. But there was a version of the machine that he was conceiving prior to building the steam turbine version that I didn't really get to talk about, and I would like to, because it points out something very profound about the current state, the state of the art of our generator, electrical generator technology. What Walter's got here, as I'm sure you can recognize, is a similarity with his steam turbine reactor, is that we have a conical core and a conical winding section on either side. But what's different about this one is there's this steel spiral armature, which bears striking resemblance to an oblate spheroid that is turned at an angle. And just looking at this one, you probably wouldn't be able to figure out what's going on, but luckily he supplies us with this other image that shows not only the problems with our current generators, but the solution that he came up with in this spiral armature. So basically, when the current is applied to these two coils, we would generate a polarization of each one of these cores. And that polarization would perform absolutely no work without this gap right here. That air gap provides unbalance. And when there's unbalance, then there is an oscillation to try to attain equilibrium again. Now, what's interesting about that is Walter's spinning this on the plane of the equator. Every single generator that we use right now is built like this up in this corner here. In fact, I think if we go, yeah, here we go. What we have up here is, this is what he calls man's dynamo, and he says it violates nature. Why does it violate nature? Because it spins the mass, the copper, through this gap in the wrong direction. It would be like as if we took the Earth and we started spinning it up and over its poles. Does it spin that way? No, it spins 90 degrees around its polar axis. And yet in our generators, to cut through a magnetic field at right angle to induce current in the coil, we spin it this way. But yet nothing in nature exhibits that property. We've never found anything that spins that way that we can see in nature. So Walter was pointing out something really significant about that, and he also basically invented a solution, which, as I said, was to put a gap in the core and have it be a slightly oblate spheroid, meaning the distribution of the mass of the armature is basically bulged at its equator and shrunken at its poles. So I don't know if you can see these lines, but you see these curved lines? He's calling this a point of deflection. So this is the point where the polarization of this core is actually kind of funneled or channeled into this material because there's a gap here. And the gap is like a resistor. The magnetic flow here will take the path of least resistance, just like an electrical current will take the path of least resistance. And so when he's gapping it here, and on the other side of the equator having the gap in the other location, in the other corner, you would get continual perpetual spin just from polarizing the core. So no longer would we have to commutate our motors. Commutator basically means that the way they have this design here is every time they have to turn it through the magnetic field, you have to switch the current because you're rotating it the wrong way through the field. So you have to constantly have a mechanical switch that switches it back and forth. But with Walter's system, we would no longer have to commutate. So Ben Palmer actually has built one of these armatures, and I wanted to especially show you pictures of things that we've built and that we're actively working on. So we're playing with these fields. You can put coils here, or you can also put permanent magnets, because essentially they do the same thing. But again, this is a way of turning the electricity into rotation, or turning rotation into electricity. So this is the reactor coil concept. You can see the double coil. I want to point out that you notice that it splits in the middle and winds two different directions. And just like Retta was saying, if you look at it from one end, it'll look clockwise. If you look at it from the other end, it'll be counterclockwise. And this is really important. Now, So this is basically showing the thermodynamic cycle that we could utilize to replace an atomic reactor, because we could generate a huge amount of heat. But do you notice this thing up here? This is actually showing you that there's another output of energy. The current comes in, winds both ways, and then just goes right into a load. So you say, okay, there's nothing special about that. It's just going to perform work from the movement of electric current. But what also is simultaneously happening is if you've polarized the core and you've centripetally wound it up. And so when you have a heat sink or any kind of armature there that absorbs the heat, it will radiate that heat, and you could capture it, in Walter's case, in a steam turbine, and it will perform additional work. So essentially you have one input and you have two outputs. And it's always been there, but science doesn't realize that it's there because they don't consider an uphill flow of energy. They only consider entropy. They only consider the things which are running downhill. This is actually showing us that we can engineer an uphill flow of energy. So this was his large coil. He called this an optical dynamo generator. In the archive material I've read, he also refers to it as an optical reactor or a space-powered gravity reactor. Because again, we're actually using the power of space. You can put this thing anywhere and it will do the same thing. So the power multiplication principle is in this, essentially, like I said last year, is an optical one. All I'm trying to do is take optical principles that Walter's describing and apply it to electrical systems, or what conventional science refers to as electromagnetic systems, or systems relating to magnets or moving current producing magnetic field. All those terminologies basically have to go in the trash when you realize that all that's happening are basically spherical intersections of light waves moving away from a center or toward a center. And when they intersect, they form lenses. And those lenses, just like a biconvex lens on a sunny day, can focus power to a point. And when you focus it to a point, you cause compression. Compression of the universal equilibrium basically is what we refer to as energy or power. So again, we start with a large volume and we've compressed it. We've organized it. You see that science is saying that entropy says, well, everything's just coming apart spontaneously. Well, what if there was a force that just took all those little pieces and went whoosh, and brought them back down together again? Guess what force is doing that? Your mind. Concentration of mind. Sometimes Russell refers to it as gravity, sometimes he refers to it as electricity, but they're really synonymous because it really just means that you've made something that occupies large volume, you've made it occupy small volume. And that's what he means by compression. So this is from the archive, this image. Nobody's seen this before. Walter was considering talking this, probably was going to put this in atomic suicide, but he says, science recently discovered that it could create an intensely hot flame in the middle of a tube. This is this white line here. A flame which burned only in its center and did not touch the walls of the tube. By highly compressing it from without, that means, from the outside in. Astonished, science referred to it as the pinch effect. Unknowingly, science has discovered nature's real process of gravity creation. The joke is that science termed this discovery pinch effect. That means the entire universe is a pinch effect, a universe of matter. This discovery was the first step in discovering that there is a force far greater than electricity, but they do not know what it is. So, like I said, I talked a lot about power multiplication last year, so I'd like to move on to power transmutation. This is work that Russell started in 1927. He had solved some issues for the Westinghouse lamp company pertaining to the plating of chromium, because they weren't sure what structure that it would crystallize in. And he solved that problem for them very, very quickly because he knew crystallization, because he knew the wave. And so rather than being paid, he just said, give me the use of your lab because I want to try something. And what he wanted to try was he wanted to take 5 cc's of water and turn it into something else. And he did, and this is the proof right here. This is the actual page that I scanned from the archives showing that on the 17th trial, he got a massive change from H2O to mostly nitrogen or inert gases. And this is the apparatus he was talking about. It consists of basically a metallic core around which coils were wrapped to cause the polarization and the contraction. And by the use of these two fields and contraction and expansion, meaning heat to expand and cooling to cause contraction, he was able to change the ratio of the gases that were in the sealed quartz tube. And he did this 17 times, and it was always different gases that came out. Believe it or not, people at Westinghouse just simply did not believe him, even though he replicated it 17 times for them. So he was ahead of his time, much like Tesla. This is an image, again, Ben Palmer made. This material, this black material that you saw in the armature is called magnetite. And it's basically a ferromagnetic material, meaning it will be electrified when a current is applied to it or when permanent magnets are applied to it as well. And here you can see, this is my lab back in Vermont when I did this. And I took the core and I can wrap coils around here and I can magnetize this thing and I get all kinds of interesting shapes of not magnetic field. I'm obliged to use that term so that I'm understood by people, but in Russell science there really is no such thing as a magnetic field. There are only electrical wave fields that are bounded by magnetic planes of zero curvature. So I'm not so interested in magnetic fields as I am electrical fields, but in my mind they're synonymous, so I sometimes have to use different terms. So this is a good picture. This was Erwin Mueller did this work in the 50s. He was actually able to photograph an atom for the first time. And what he found is that despite all the preaching about the Bohr theory of the atom, the nucleus is actually nothing. It's a hole. There's no protons. There's no neutrons. And also, just forgetting all the science for a minute, what does this actually look like? Doesn't this look like ripples in water? But this is a metal. This is tungsten. But when you get down small enough, you can see that it just looks like a kaleidoscope. It's just optical illusion. But what I like about it is it just proves that Russell is dead on when he says that the center of every atom is just mind. So you don't see it. It's invisible. So then the Russells gave us this periodic chart showing that the inert gases are the fixed points of the string. You see here carbon being the midtone. It's pegs on its, if you imagine that this is a fretboard of a guitar, for example, the pegs are your inert gases. They don't move. They're fixed. But all the vibratory motion of that string wobbling gives you all these different kinds of states of motion, which we call elements. And so the midtone being carbon here is exactly cutting the string in half, just like you could in a guitar. You would hit the fifth of the octave. So transmutation, how is it achieved? It's achieved the same way you tune a guitar. You lengthen or shorten its wavelength and thus adjust its frequency or its cycles, its rhythmic balanced interchange, and make it occupy a different pressure condition in each octave. And this is what nature is doing all the time. It's only when we get up into the ninth octaves where radioactive elements are splitting apart nearly the speed of light that we get into the dangerous ones, because these ones down here, you're made out of these. Your own body is mostly these ones right here. Carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen. So this is a whole new understanding of atomic structure, and as such, we will be able to transmute elements. Now I want to talk about power projection. It's based upon this new optical principle of invisible light of space. The primary purpose of power projection is its commercial value of eliminating cables for power transmission through knowledge of the control of nature's manner of power transmission by light waves. Does nature use cables to connect one point of the universe to another point? It uses light waves. So why can't we use light waves to transmit power? We should be able to. So anything that happens anywhere happens everywhere. If you want proof of this, we have these mirror cubes, and you can look inside them, and there's a seeming paradox because what your eye is telling you on the inside of this cube is that it extends to an infinity. Yet you're holding the cube, and you can see that it's finite. It has a boundary. So we have a simultaneous infinite extension within a bounded one. And so anything that happens on the inside happens everywhere. And you're inside of a cosmic cube right now called the universe. So anything that happens here happens everywhere. Walter says you can't move your pinky finger without the whole entire universe adjusting around it to keep it in balance. So this is another quote from Walter from the archive, but he said, "There's nothing more simple than extending a spark to another place if a wire is used to extend that spark. That is because there is no change of dimension in the wave fields of the wire carrying the current. It's the same diameter. They do not expand in surrounding space, hence they do not have to be regenerated, which means condensed or amplified. Not so with wireless, though. Dimensions change rapidly and must be recompressed from their expanded state, just like an echo." So we have to talk about the master of power projection, which of course was Nikola Tesla. This is basically his proposal was he was going to erect one tower, and that one tower could power the entire world. Now, how the heck could that happen? It also, without wires, forgot to mention that part, that the energy would be available literally anywhere on the surface. Because unlike Marconi, Tesla was not trying to send electromagnetic waves through the air from an antenna. He was actually doing the exact opposite. He was sending all the vibratory information down into the earth, and his ground rod was up in the air. So he was air grounding it. And he said, if I hit the resonant frequency of this earth, then I can turn this earth, which is just a giant capacitor plate, into a resonant power supply that you could pull out the power at any point, anywhere, with no interconnecting lines or cables or anything. And he has this analogy, if you take an inflatable ball and you can pump pressure into it, you'll see that if you put pressure gauges anywhere to allow the incoming pressure to escape, you would be able to read it no matter where you put or anywhere that you put the gauge, basically, you would read it. And as such, you could do the same with electrical power. So he had already solved this problem, but we still have power lines everywhere, don't we? So Tesla says in My Inventions, which is his autobiography, he said, "My belief is firm in the law of compensation. The true rewards are ever in proportion to the labor and sacrifices made. This is one of the reasons why I feel certain that of all of my inventions, the magnifying transmitter," which was that tower in the previous slide, "will prove most important and valuable to future generations. I am prompted to this prediction not so much by thoughts of the commercial and industrial revolution which it will surely bring about, but of the humanitarian consequences of the many achievements it makes possible." I think this is one of the most important things that Tesla ever said to us, because he's telling us that the magnifying transmitter is the thing to pay attention to. So we need to consider the magnifying transmitter, which is a form of a resonant transformer, more carefully and see why Tesla picked this device as the most important one for our future. This is the patent art of transmitting electrical energy through the natural mediums. You don't have to read this whole thing, but I want you to pay attention to this one sentence at the bottom here. He says, I have found it practicable to produce in this manner an electrical moment thousands of times greater than the initial. That is the one impressed upon the secondary by the primary. I don't know how he got this through the patent office, but I'm pretty sure he just said that he got more power out than he put in. Did everybody else see that? And there's the patent number 787412. So what the heck is a resonant transformer, and why is it doing this? This is the image from the patent. You can see, what is the coil? It's a spiral, and it's a flat spiral. So he has a primary coil, and he has a circuit in another patent which is actually powering this primary coil. But all you really need to know is that he was creating successive electrical discharges, not alternating current. He stopped using alternating current. Even though he's the father of the AC, polyphase distribution system, Tesla basically called AC a failed experiment because he found something way better. He found that he could take capacitors and charge them and discharge them at any frequency he wanted, even way above radio frequency. And no mechanical alternator can get up to that speed. So he was producing successive capacitive discharges around this very large radius primary. And this was inducing, as he says, thousands of horsepower in his secondary coil. They didn't really measure watts back then, they just measured horsepower. And then again, you see the line going up, that's the one that goes up to the top of the tower. But why is it creating so much energy? We have to go to Walter Russell, because Walter's saying there's a power multiplication principle of intersecting waveforms that makes a gradient of compression toward the center. Do you notice that this wire here coming in, it's cut off in the bottom, but that wire is coming from the earth. So if you trace the circuit, it's coming up and then going around and around and around toward the center. And anything that moves from the outside toward the inside, as I said before, is making large volume, small volume, and that increases the potential. So this is an optical effect. But Tesla found it and was using it to generate huge amounts of power. He would also ground the primary and the secondary coil. But if anybody's familiar with electronics or coil making, what's weird about that is that effectively, if you short these two coils, the primary and the secondary, it becomes one wire. It's a one-wire system. But the arrangement of the wires creates a large amount of potential gain. So this is patent 593138. He just calls it an electrical transformer. It doesn't call any attention to the peculiarities of it. But notice that he's using conical secondary coils. The cone. So it can either be a flat spiral or it can be an extended spiral. Imagine taking that center point and extending it out. You would end up with a cone. And you can see the discharge from the top of the cone. I mean, this is probably hundreds of thousands of volts there. And Tesla at his Colorado station was able to make 100,000 ampere discharges that would jump hundreds of feet using this method. So I want to talk about this one back here, because there's another way to do this if you don't want to use a conical coil. You can split the coil in two and wind one counterclockwise and the other one clockwise and put them together, and basically put them together, center tap them, as it's called. And I read this and I thought, well, why would he use a cylinder? Because it seems like he was getting much more energy out of a cone, which would make sense. But then I found in a book by Leland Anderson, there's this quote from Tesla where he's specifically talking about this coil, and he says, the secondary coil constructed in this manner has many important advantages, the chief ones being the safety in handling and the facility it affords for obtaining potentials far beyond those producible if ordinary methods of construction are followed. So what is he really saying? He's saying in all systems where we wind a coil in one direction and just layer it up with turns, we're throwing about half of the power away. If you use the male and the female, the balance principle, you would use two coils wound in opposite directions. And in this manner, he was able to create the largest potential difference between these 2 points, which basically translates to a large amount of electrical power. Because power is potential first. We don't have amperage until there's a resistive load, and then there is work being done. So Tesla was able to create a very, very long wire and coil it up to make sure that the potential was as far apart as you could get it from the induction of the primary onto the secondary. And I think that's extremely significant because we don't build transformers this way. Not today. So the center tap dual coil, Russell had it too. It was in his schematic for the optical dynamo. It's the exact same coil circuit. And he says this wiring is a two-way opposed directional system, which nature relentlessly makes use of in its every effect, versus the inefficient one-way wiring system, which ignores the fact of nature, because nature divides in equilibrium by opposing before it multiplies for uniting. So again, we need to learn how to engineer an uphill flow of energy before we use the downhill flow of energy to produce lights or to run your refrigerator or what have you. So I want to show you that, yeah, you can actually build these things, and that really does work. I have an iron core lamination from a transformer. I wound a double coil on it in mirror image relation, red and the blue, male and the female. And I connect them electrically in parallel so that there's an interesting thing which happens. I've actually doubled the number of turns in the coil, but I've halved the resistance because each coil is equal length, just like each man and woman is positive. They're two positive effects, or efforts, I should say. And you can see when you put iron filings here, you have created poles. And since I'm using alternating current, I have a hot and a neutral, not a positive and a negative anyways. And the fields are actually moving back and forth, creating an oscillation. So when you see this in real life, these iron filings on the ends are actually pulsating 60 times a second, showing you the 60 hertz alternating current coming from your wall. So here's a Tesla transformer. Notice the secondary again is conical. The primary are these copper tubes wrapped around it. There's always gaps, air gaps between the primary that basically factors into what's called the Q value of the coil. But the reason I want to point this out is because this image is identical to this secondary, and this is from Walter Russell in Atomic Suicide. And this is what Tesla actually built in probably the 30s. So these guys were definitely sharing the same source, let's say. And just to point out that one is also center tapped, meaning it splits in the middle, just like the other one. So when you fire this thing up, you'd have huge arcs between these 2 points, or basically power, lots of it. So this was a little bit about last year. I just want to show you the conical coil concept that I talked about last year, showing that there's compression on one end, meaning stronger pull force, and on the other end, there's expanded force. And notice that it's on the periphery. So basically, I'm showing you what science would term an electromagnet, but I'm showing it to you in a way that is actually proving that electromagnetic is optics, because you can expand one end and contract the other end, and there's a difference in the magnetic field. And the reason I did this is because I'd never seen it done, and I wanted to know, and I wanted to verify what Walter was talking about, that if you had a nail, which is compressed iron, it would stick to one end of that magnet, but not the other one. But it will stick if you take that nail and turn it into a powder. Then it'll be here. Oops. It will be here. So mass equivalence. Each end is doing the same amount of work, but one's expanded and one is contracted. So it's an optical effect, but I applied it to an electromagnet and found something significant about the universe. And then I went a step further and I replicated his atomic suicide on page 133. He says you'll basically make an iron sphere in the center. And indeed, when I applied current to my coil, and if I get the polarity of each one of these cores correct, I do in fact make a compressed sphere, just like he says. Now let's go beyond this, because I covered this last year. I want to make it very clear that when he's showing you these directions of north and south, it's different than the north and south on a normal magnet, because I can create a magnetic field that creates expansion out in an invisible plane, meaning that there is an invisible plane there, but we're not utilizing it. So what I have here is a different polarization of the core. And in the center here, I'm creating ejecting rings that will basically electrify these washers and suspend them in midair, just like the rings around Saturn. So here's another view. So all I've done here is applied magnets on the ends of the conical steel cores, and by the arrangement of the fields, I can make an expansive field that can just keep extending out here. Oops. And here's another view. So just magnets, I'm not even applying any current to the coil, but you can do the exact same thing, polarizing the core by using the turns, the ampere turns. They're synonymous and identical to permanent magnet field. So this is the last image before I'm gonna do a little demonstration for you guys. But this is a ring magnet. It's neodymium, so it's very strong. And underneath it, I have a ferro cell, which you can buy online. They're really cool things. It's just two pieces of glass, and there's ferromagnetic particles suspended in it. And in the presence of a magnetic field and LEDs, which are kind of around the inside here, you can actually, it takes a minute, but your eyes will eventually start to see these curved shapes. But what I find really interesting is that at the dead center, just like an atom, there's absolutely nothing. It's a hole. So this isn't just atomic structure. This is magnetic fields. This is electricity. This is everything. So what does your mind have to do with electricity? Everything. It has everything to do with it. Thanks. You good? Okay. Thank you very much. Bless you all. I love you. Thank you for coming.